We continue our sermon series this morning that we're calling The Never-Ending Story in 5 acts. And as I offer this cursory examination of the book of Numbers, which is in fact Act 3, I am using 2
as we close off
significant viewpoints that the Hebrew scholars found helpful in summarizing its contents. I'm just going to hold for a minute. I'm not seeing any slides up there. So we're just catching up. So I'm using 2 significant viewpoints that the Hebrew scholars have found helpful in summarizing its contents. One is the Jewish saying that should be just well embedded in your memories by now. God has time and the wilderness has sand. And the second one is that of one of the Hebrew names for the book of Numbers, and God spoke. So if you recall, to begin our journey in Numbers, I asked the question, when God speaks, are we listening? And last week I continued that theme with the question, when God speaks, do we understand the language? Do we accept that we discover something about God's character by what he says and how he says it? What we discovered in the chapters that we looked at is that he is consistent in the various ways that he chooses to reveal himself. And I made the point that humans have great difficulty separating themselves from their own self-interestedness and allowing God to have his rightful place at the center of his universe. It's about him, all about him, and it's not about us. Now, when it came to his communication with his people through Moses, God was clear and direct. He commanded and he expected obedience. But instead, as we discovered, he got complaining and pushback. So this week, I ask another question, and here it is. When God speaks, will we hear and obey? And I'm going to answer my own question right off the bat. I think the answer is no, or at least not very often. Not then, in the hot, dry, inhospitable wilderness that Moses' followers found themselves, and not now, in this particular day and age. Oh, I think we give lip service as Christians to the idea of obedience. Of course, obedience and submission are major tenets of the faith. But as we discovered last week, it was at that time easier to complain, to rationalize, and use others as scapegoats than to move forward in obedience. And I wonder if that isn't just as true in our day and age now. As a matter of fact, I think I made that point last week. So this week, I want to stay parked on that theme of obedience and take a look at why this may be the case. And our text this morning, so well read, provides us with some pretty good insight into that. But first, let's do a little geography refresher to see how the behavior of Yahweh's chosen people actually impacted their reality. So a question. How long do you think that it would take a very large group of people to walk from this church, Queensway Baptist in Brantford, Ontario, to Quebec City? Any guesses? Well, according to Google Maps, it would take a single adult approximately 38 days to make that journey on foot. And now let's say that because of the size of the crowd and logistical difficulties, we will multiply that by a difficulty factor of 3. So 38 days times 3 is 114 days, or about 1/3 of 1 year. So take a look at this map. Now you see that thick green line at the top of the map. I superimposed that line over the most direct caravan route that is thought to have existed around the time of the Exodus. That route was between Lower Egypt and the land of Canaan. The distance is about 900 kilometers, or about the same as from here to Quebec City. Now, their journey required a little more time than our theoretical hike might take, since they had to cross a hot and dangerously dry desert. But even so, with a difficulty factor of 3, it should have taken them about 114 days. Yet, as we've discovered, it takes the people of God 2 generations just to get to the point where they can actually move forward into the place chosen for them by God. But even before that can take place, as our text for this morning begins, they're practically there. They're literally knocking on the door. They see the promised land. It has been a long time coming, but by God's goodness and mercy, they're on the threshold of victory. It's virtually theirs now. But then suddenly reality sets in. There are people already living in the land that God has promised them. And in order to claim it as their own, they're going to have to fight them. They're going to have to fight for the land. And we're going to find that their enthusiasm kind of vanishes once again. And the people of God are plunged into the throes of another spiritual crisis. In fact, the better part of the next 40 years is spent right there on the brink of the promised land, bogged down in their fear and their uncertainty. Let me tell you just how paralyzed they became. It would be like this group of people traveling from our church to Quebec City, stopping at, say, Trois-Rivières, which is a city on the way to Quebec City, but it's only about 70 kilometers away. And for some reason, we could go no farther. But instead, we back up and we wander around Quebec's Gaspé Peninsula for about 40 years before we ever move on and into Quebec City. Sounds almost unbelievable, doesn't it? But that's exactly what happened to the people of God. There's always a possibility of failure to trust and obey when you realize that the future is uncertain. And good things never come without a struggle. And I think that little tidbit of information has very real implications for each of us individually, as well as for this wonderful little family of God that that worship here at Queensway Baptist Church. So 3 things jumped out at me as I prepared this message. First, anything can happen. Life is filled with uncertainty. 2, nothing can happen that God can't use. And 3, God knows what comes next, even if we don't. So let's look at these 3 things in a bit of detail this morning. First, anything can happen. Life is filled with uncertainty. Job, in the Bible, got up one morning ready to carry on his day as usual, and within a very short period of time, he had lost his money, his health, his family, and his home. Now that was unexpected. On a beautiful summer's day in 1967, Joni Eareckson and her sister rode their horses to the Chesapeake Bay to go for a swim. Joni dived into shallow water, struck her head on a rock, and became a quadriplegic, paralyzed from the neck down for the rest of her life. Now that was totally unexpected. On December the 30th, 2019, the church was presented with a video where Pastor Dean announced that he was leaving Queensway. And for many people, that was totally unexpected. In 2020, most of the world was rocks with the effects and the restrictions of a worldwide pandemic. And that was totally unexpected. In 2007, Carol and I were greeted by a knock on our front door at 6 a.m. in the morning. It was a police officer there to tell us that our niece, whom we raised, had been killed by an impaired driver in a highway accident. Now that was totally unexpected. And I am sure that every one of you have your own story of the unexpected occurrence in your own lives. In Numbers 13, 27 to 33, we have the people of Israel ready to enter the land of their dreams, and God tells them to send some men to check it out. Makes sense? Isn't that part of the discernment process? Seems like a practical and rational approach that before any action is taken, they would need to see what they were getting into. And once again, God proves himself to be the methodical God of procedure. So a small group of men, each one a leader of the 12 primary family clans, were selected to infiltrate and learn everything they could about the land. Its people, its economy, its defenses. They wanted to know everything it's possible to know in advance. They wanted as many answers as they could get up front. They wanted as much certainty and reassurance as they could get before they took another step. The problem was they wanted no surprises, and they wanted a guarantee of success. They had it, but they didn't recognize it. One of the things that I learned from running my own company, my own business, is that most of the time, many folks don't have what it takes to make hard decisions. There's a kind of a whole manager category created that are known as SICs, S-I-Cs, second in command. And they serve a very valid function. I had one. I had a general manager of my company. And these folks are very good at creating and running systems, but are often they're just far too rational. They weigh things too much, needing to know the possible results of all of the alternatives. They kind of drill into things, and they get kind of frozen there. And that can slow things down and impede progress. Sometimes a SIC, a second in command, is simply not capable of making the hard decision to either say no or to move forward without having all the answers. That's something I learned the hard way. And it can happen in churches, you know. Of course, it's good to have as much information as possible available to us when we're making decisions, but sometimes if we look hard enough for it, we'll find enough information that'll actually scare us out of making any decision at all. Risks go with decision making, but risks are usually too hard for people who think too much. The really important decisions, though, often have to be made without certainty. Example, if we get married, we do it without a guarantee that we are making the absolute right decision, without any certainty that it's going to last, not knowing how difficult the challenges are that we will face along the way. When we make a decision to follow Jesus, we do it on faith, and often we're fighting recurring doubts all along the way. Typically, it's only after we have made decisions that we have any sense as to whether we did the right thing, or even when we convince ourselves that our decisions are right, we still may have times of doubt, wondering what might have been if we had chosen differently. But sometimes, both as individuals and as a church, we find ourselves without an option. Circumstances are such that a decision must be made. To do nothing at all is simply not an option. There seems to be no escape from the tension of having to make up our mind, but the truth is, if we don't decide, someone or something else will decide it for us. So our church council, for example, found themselves in such a predicament last year. They inherited a church without a lead pastor, in an uproar over certain events that had occurred, and all of a sudden, they were faced with a mandated shutdown of the entire church because of a worldwide health crisis. Now, that was totally unexpected, for sure. Now, could they choose to ignore that and carry on with a normal leadership transition process? No, not hardly. They were given no choice. To ignore the unexpected was to court possible disaster. It would have been great if they could have carried on and attempted to deal with the fallout for everything that had happened in our church. But the decision was more or less taken out of their hands. God had allowed something very serious to occur, and it took all of the church's leadership energy to focus on the immediate threat and try to maintain as much normalcy as possible. But in reality, they had no more of an idea of how either the church situation or the pandemic situation was going to turn out. That was totally uncertain. When folks find themselves in uncertain situations, they become afraid sometimes. The fear is generated through a perceived powerlessness. What often happens in situations like that is that people try to do nothing and find a way to rationalize the refusal to act. But your council did not do that. They sought God, and they also sought sound advice. But they acted according to what they deemed appropriate for the severity of the risk that we faced. Good, godly people. And we are just so lucky to have them in our leadership. Now, Moses' followers found themselves in a situation where it was clear that God wanted them to literally move forward in a particular direction, and they also sadly discovered that opportunities do not wait forever. When the spies that we read about, and remember that they were also leaders, returned from their fact-finding mission, the majority only confirmed the people's worst fears. 10 of the 12 report numerous obstacles to overcome. The people who occupy the promised land are strong, and their cities well defended. We've read that in Numbers 13, verse 28. In fact, the people of God have had run-ins with some of the same folks and have gotten the worst of it on those occasions. Numbers 13, verse 29. And as far as the spies can tell, the people of God are simply inferior to this opposition. In their own words, I quote, "We felt like grasshoppers in a land of giants." Numbers 13:33. Their conclusion is, can't be done. It couldn't have been a more discouraging report. What do you or I do when we face obstacles that discourage us? Uncertainty, the uncertainty of tomorrow. Are we inclined to think in terms of a worst case scenario, to catastrophize? Do we tend to exaggerate the obstacles, overstate the problems, and magnify the difficulties that we expect to encounter? Are we like the 10 spies who just concluded that it simply cannot be done? Well, they found giants, huge issues that were beyond their resources or their capabilities or their abilities. What do we do when we face the giants in our lives? Do we look at the obstacles in our life or the life of our church in the same way as the spies saw the occupants of the promised land? Do we wonder and acknowledge how hard it's going to be? Do we convince ourselves that it can't be done? Do we feel like a grasshopper in comparison and that all we can think about is failing, perhaps getting stepped on? That's called feeling powerless. But perhaps we need to learn the lesson of this passage before it is too late. Because when we focus on the pitfalls instead of the prize, we may fall right into the pit. None of those who were afraid to go ever got into the promised land. Not one. They were buried in the wilderness by their children. Numbers 14, 20 to 23 says, and let's read this. Then the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word, but truly as I live, and all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord. None of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt, in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not obeyed my voice, none of them shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers, and none of those who despised me shall see it. Only their children and their children's children lived to see the dream come true. God has time, and the wilderness has sand. Have you ever traveled a mountain road where signs are posted which read, Falling Rock? What do? Do you pull over and frantically look at your map for another route? Do you refuse to budge another inch because you were afraid of what might happen? Oh my goodness, rocks may fall on us. Do you slow your speed and practically crawl and keep your eyes peeled overhead for plummeting debris? I doubt that we would do any of those things, because we know that while there is the remote possibility of a rock falling on our car, it's not likely. And you also know that if you take your eyes off the road, you are much more likely to have an accident than you are to be injured by boulders cascading down the mountain. You also know that unless you keep going, you're never, ever going to get to your destination. If we're going to live successfully and function productively as a church, we must learn how to live with the uncertainties of life. We need to overcome our fear and move on in spite of the obstacles in our way. Moving on to number 2. Nothing can happen that God can't use. Caleb was one of the spies sent to gather recognizance about the land. When the people started to grumble with fear, he said in Numbers 13:30, I quote, "But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, 'Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it.'" Isn't it interesting that 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, saw the same land as the other 10, and they said go, while the others screamed no? Why do people have different reactions to the same reality? It's partly because of this. I offer you a Lloydism this morning. We see things as they are. We see things not as they are, but as we are. That certainly explains the spies' reactions. 10 saw the barriers, 2 saw the blessings. 10 saw giants, 2 saw God moving ahead of them, preparing the way. 10 saw fortified cities, and their faith crumbled. 2 had faith and saw the fortified cities crumble when God allowed only them to enter the land. By their faith in action, 2 men said, God's best is yet to be. And by their lack of faith and lack of action, 10 men's discouragement became contagious. Chapter 14 tells us that all the people that heard their negative report and sensed their fear cried out in doubt. Essentially, they said, the best is behind us. Let's go back to Egypt. We were better off in the past than we will be in the future. Brothers and sisters, I think there's a principle here that we need to acknowledge. Do we sometimes find comfort in a nostalgic view of the past that is not really based on reality? It is a problem if our rose-colored view of what we used to do is not based on its effectiveness, but on a fear of trying something new, of moving into a new territory that we have not traveled before. Perhaps all we see is the dangerous curves in the road and rock croppings looming overhead like huge stone giants, and we're afraid to risk moving forward. This is not a healthy place to be, either for a church leader, and neither is it healthy for those being led. It breeds inertia, and it creates the difficulty for leaders who are just trying to obey a call. It's no wonder that the Lord placed the mantle of leadership upon Joshua and Caleb instead of the gloom and doomers. Your leaders are called to be people of faith, unafraid of adversity, knowing that if God be in it, none can successfully be against it. As a church, for sure, we are facing difficult times. But I beg you not to succumb to resentment and grumbling, and please don't sit idly by waiting for the difficulties to be removed as if your pastors and your leaders can wave some magic wand. It's not going to happen. Because it is in hardship and in difficulty that we can learn endurance. The Apostle Paul made that so clear. It is in trials and testing that we can become strong. I believe that when the pressure's on, we have our greatest opportunities to trust God and to discover His power. Look, I know that there are folks in our congregation who face difficult circumstances. There are economic and family struggles, there are health challenges, and there are relational difficulties. I get it. My heart breaks for you, but I beg you not to give in to despair and inertia. Take a small step. Believe that God is there to hold your hand, because He is. He said so. We know that the Christian faith is more than merely being and believing. It is also doing and serving. In fact, the Christian life is supremely about doing and serving. Even in hard times. And thank God that there are many wonderful people doing just that right here at Queensway. Look, I know that we are living in unstable and uncertain times. I know how difficult it is in these times. I know that it's difficult to not worry and to not be overcome by the doom and gloom forecasts that are all around us in our culture. But they have nothing to do with the vision of God. God sees a shining city on a hill. God sees His churches, including this one, filled with new converts and busy Christ followers coming alongside, building relationships and supporting them as they grow in Christ. Let me remind you, nothing can happen that God cannot use. We are God's people. We belong to Him, not to the father of lies. Besides that, this is God's church, and nothing will destroy His church. Not pandemics or loss of leadership or lack of money. Not even the gates of hell can prevail against it. You just count on this. Even if you can't count on anything else, God controls the future. God controls your future and our future as a church. And when the future is left in God's control, there is only hope and promise. So Queensway, in these times and under these pressures, God's people are expected to keep on moving. We've been called to live out dreams following God's vision. Like Moses and Joshua and Caleb, we are to make some leaps of faith to step out and attempt the great and seemingly impossible things that we believe God has called us to do. We can't wait for certainty or the assurance that everything will work. We must take risks if we are truly to be a people of faith. We must be ready to bet our lives on God's vision because we believe that with God all things are possible. We believe that vision is to reach the people of our community with a full, impactful, life-changing gospel of Jesus Christ. And how do we know that? We know it because God has sent spies ahead of us, and they have left us with reports. Here is such a report. I quote to you from the introduction of the church history of Queensway Baptist Church, 1952 to 1982. Listen to this. I quote, "It is with a great deal of pleasure that I write this introduction to the story of 30 years of ministry for Christ through the Queensway congregation. It has often been said that the Acts of the Apostles is an unfinished book. In a very real sense, that is true. Here in the Henderson subdivision in Brantford, a continuing chapter of the Acts of God's people has been in the writing for 30 years. The writer goes on. Some people measure the history of a congregation by the ministers who have offered pastoral leadership. And certainly, this history records the number of men whom God has called into pastoral ministry here. However, it is my contention that the ongoing work is performed by the regular active participants in the congregation's life. This story is then a story about people with a dream and a faith. A dream that said God could do something wonderful in this place, and a faith that believed that he would. I pay tribute to their dream, their faith, and their commitment to the goals which have been realized. May the next era in this congregation's life be as fruitful and rewarding in the service of our Lord as the last 30 years have been. Signed, Kenneth W. Morrison, Pastor. That is a report from a spy who went into the land and saw its potential as God sees it. God's vision has not changed. The report, though documenting past events, still speaks to a view of the present. The acts of God's people here at Queensway are still being written. Brothers and sisters, people and churches talk a lot about potential, but when will we realize that there is absolutely no correlation between potential and performance? Lots of people and churches have unbelievable potential. But do they ever do anything with it? That's another thing that I found out by running my own business. No, they don't. This church is alive. It needs work, it needs resources, but believe me, believe God, it is not without a future story. Some things will change. Our structure needs to be simplified so that we can be flexible and we can respond to the reality of the land where God has placed us. And it is not a hospitable land. It has its own giants and its own fortified cities. But, and this brings me to my final point, God knows what comes next, even if we don't. He knows the future because he is in the future at the same time that he is in the present. The text reminds us that because of God, there is no reason to be afraid of tomorrow. Numbers 13:30. But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let's go up at once and occupy it, for we will be able to overcome it. In his excellent little book entitled When God Whispers Your Name, Max Lucado tells a wonderful story about his then 4-year-old daughter, Sarah. So her favorite game is to jump into her father's arms. When she gets him at just the right distance, not too close, mind you, but not too far away either, she crouches and she springs and then throws her whole self at him. Superman without a cape, skydiver without a parachute. Her only hope is in her father. If he proves weak, she'll fall. If he proves cruel, she'll crash. If he forgets, she'll tumble to the hard floor. But she doesn't worry about any of that because she trusts her father. 4 years under the same roof with him has convinced her that he is reliable. So she flies and soars, and he always catches her. One day, Sarah's older sister was watching, and Max asked Sarah if she would jump to Andrea, but Sarah refused. Her father tried to coax her, but she wouldn't budge. "Why not?" he asked. "I only jump into big arms," she said. Well, don't we all? If we think the arms are weak, we won't jump either, will we? Look, don't worry. Go ahead and jump. God controls the future. He'll catch you. He will not let us fall. God can be trusted. There's no need to be afraid. Unless you don't really want to trust and obey. For there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. Amen. Amen.